This is day 2 of Unit 21, closing procedures. We'll finish up tonight. There's a good bit of math, but that is not a problem. We got that math covered. It's very similar. All the math can be summed up, if you recall, to 2 times 3 equals 6. Oops, that was not on purpose, sorry. There we go. That's what I wanted. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. Now, that's what I wanted. Yeah, so the math we're going to be covering, and what we left off with the other night last week was who pays for what. Do you remember? You tell me. Hopefully you've been reading ahead. Who would pay for deed preparation? The preparation of the deed. Wow, that is really red.
The seller.
Yeah, because it's like if you're selling your car, you're preparing the car, you're washing it just to get the most for it. Think of it that way. That's the memory aid that I use. So deed prep is a seller expense. And just FYI, it runs about, well, on the test they'll probably say things like $200 or $300. In real life, it's about $400 to $600. But they are literally writing the deed. How are they making the deed? How is the attorney writing that deed? Where do they get their information from that they need to create the deed with?
Would that be the contract?
You got it. And so that goes back to one of those testable questions. Which is the more important document, the deed or the contract? It's the contract because it is the contract that informs the deed. You can say it that way. The contract tells the deed what it needs to have on it. What else? Oh, expenses. The excise tax. Who pays excise tax?
That's also the seller.
You got it. There you go. That is another seller item. I'm going to find the slide here in a second. What about for those of you who have read ahead, what about something called interim interest? Interim interest.
That's the buyer.
Yeah, what is it? What is interim interest? If we look at, and this is what we're going to get into tonight, so don't worry if this is new information to you. But remember that the real estate, the mortgage payment, when is that paid? Do you pay your mortgage before you live there for a given month or after you live there? when you pay rent on the first of the month so that you can stay there that month. So if we have October, November, December, and we're talking about rent, I'm gonna find a good pen here in a second. Then you're paying rent here on the first in order to live there for the month of October, right? You get to live there all of October, but you have to pay that rent first. When we're making a house payment, though, and you own the house, the payment you make on November 1st is because you lived there in October. It covered October. It's called arrears. Arrears. You make your payment in arrears. Another vocabulary word for you to know. Okay, with that said, let's say we close on the 27th of October. October 27th is our closing. That lender, that new lender for that buyer, we're talking about just the buyer's new lender. They say, well, welcome to the family. So glad you picked us to loan you money. Your first normal mortgage payment is not going to be due until December 1st. If we close October 27th, their first normal mortgage payment is going to be on December 1st. And that is for living there their first full month, November. That's for November because it's in arrears. And so that lender's going to say, so good news. You don't have to make a big fat payment for like a whole month and a few days. But guess what else that lender's going to say? That lender's going to say, but welcome to the family again, but you still are going to have to pay us for the 27th, 28th, 29th, and 30th of this month. That is kind of your first official payment, except it's not the full amount. We're going to prorate, this lender says, we're going to prorate 4 days of interest in this case. 4 days of interest that covers the interim between closing day and the end of the month. That's why it's called interim interest. And it's the buyer's expense because it has nothing to do with the seller at all. Seller's not involved in this. This is between the buyer and their lender. Lender says, welcome to the family. You can start making your first official big normal size payment on December 1st. It covers November. But until then, we need 4 days from you. We need 4 days worth of interest to be collected from the buyer at closing. So that's one of the things the attorney's paralegal is going to figure out. First, they're going to say how many days, including the day of closing, through the end of the month of closing. In this case, 4 days. Then they're going to say at how much interest per day. So calculating interim interest involves those two steps. Figuring up the number of days left in the month of the actual closing month, and then how many dollars per day for interest. How would we figure that out? Any guesses, any random thoughts of what information? We've done it. You have experienced enough to be able to figure out how to calculate daily interest. How do we calculate daily interest? Any thoughts from what we've already done back in the 14 and 15? Units 14 and 15?
You just divide your total monthly interest by 30.
Pretty much. I see what track you're on, but how do we get that monthly interest? Pretty much got it, but we got to start with a big number and divide it to get down to daily. Yeah. So annual interest paid is found by multiplying together what two things? What two pieces of information? Talking about the mortgage. What two things are on the bottom of this T formula? Annual interest in dollars is on the top. To get that, you multiply what times what?
Isn't it called like a T factor or whatever it does? Like it falls on the chart that like single digit number.
Oh, you're thinking about the loan factor?
Yeah,
The
I
loan
believe
factor?
so.
That we did the loan factor math using that chart in order to calculate monthly principal and interest. And so that was step 1. Step 2, because that doing that was what we needed to use to calculate what our loan balance would be after the first month. So you're on the right track. Step 1, figure out monthly principal and interest using the loan factor. Step 2 is what we need to do now. Step 2 from that is what we need to do.
Balance due and interest rate.
You said interest rate. What was the first thing you said?
Balance due.
Yeah, the loan amount. Sure. And so if it's the very first payment, what are we going to use for loan amount? It's going to be the original one, right? We don't need to worry about the current one. The current one is the original one because this is all about closing day. Everything we calculate in this unit 21 is about as of the day of closing. So, yeah, you're right. It just so happens that that loan amount is the one we're starting with. So if we borrow $200,000 at a 6.5% interest rate, that's going to give us annual interest just accidentally. Let me make sure that's right. I didn't even mean to make that so easy. Yeah, of $13,000 per year. And now that we know our annual interest, how do we calculate daily interest?
Divided by 360.
You got it. I like it. Our interest per day is $36.11 per day. How many days? 4. Because here's the other confusing part that will mess you up on this type of problem. You need to include the day of closing in your number of days addition. When you're adding up number of days, it includes the day of closing. Why does that matter? Because it's unusual in that every other calculation we do for closing math has the seller paying for the day of closing, right? It'll make more sense when we do taxes and stuff, but you'll learn that in a minute. Almost everything that we calculate, the seller has to be responsible for paying for that day of closing. But in this case, it's interim interest between the buyer and their new loan. So the seller is nowhere in sight. They are not involved in this calculation. They have nothing to do with the buyer's new loan. Therefore, why should they pay for the day of closing? But we still, because it's drilled in our heads, seller pays day of closing, and we forget, and we add up 3 days instead of 4. But if we do it right, 4 days at $36.11 per day, I'm just going to leave the whole number in the calculator. And it might end up with a different number than what you get. But again, if you choose to do that just for time's sake, the sake of saving time, it's okay. Because on the test, they will never give you 144.44 as one choice and then 100. Oh, it turns out that that's exactly the same thing. Sometimes when you leave the whole number in the calculator, it gives you a slightly different number than if you round. But they will never test you on the different. They'll never give you 2 answer choices that are only a rounding error apart or a difference in how you handled the rounding apart. So don't worry about that. It'll be it'll be far enough away that it will be obvious.
So, I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So, like the months that have 31 days, do we just stop at 30 or do we include the 31st day?
For our class, for this test, the PSI for pre-licensing, you'll use 30 days on everything. Good question. Good question. We're using 30 days, 360 days in the year, 30 days per month for all your math until you get your license. Then when you have to start taking post-licensing, it goes back to real world. Some months are 28, some months are 31, and they'll tell you. They still don't try to really trick you with it. When you hit post, they just make you do the real world numbers though. But 30 days a month for your purposes here. That was a little preview. We're going to get more into that stuff today. So let's take a look. We'll pick up where we left off. Maybe we'll do a little, let's back up some here. We talked about RESPA, and it's for federally related new loans. And what does that mean? That means which types of loans, if they are federally related. Keeping in mind that after 2008 and all that catastrophe, the government said, you lenders did it wrong. You really screwed up a lot of people. Sadly, a lot of the people who made decisions and kind of created procedures that led to people's demise, like almost predatorially made loans for subprime borrowers that don't have great credit. They gave them, that pick-a-pay program, little adjustable rates, things that set people up for failure who were already close to the line financially. Not a lot of people went to prison, not a lot of the higher-ups. They kind of just found other things to stay millionaires with. But the government stepped in and said, we need to oversee this approval process, this loan process. And so they said, we're going to look over everything. We're going to oversee all loans. So basically all loan types, not just FHA and VA, but when it comes to RESPA and Regulation X, it covers everything, conventional, FHA, and VA. There we go. Now we're back. So that's Regulation X. Something else under RESPA. Well, it started in 74. It's been revised over the years. And one of the revisions, well, back then, let's start there. Back then, it's there to protect consumers from lenders being jerks. And it's also there to protect consumers a little bit from real estate brokers. It makes it so that we're not allowed as brokers to get kickbacks. So if you think about it, would it make more of an impact? Would you trust me more if I'm your broker and I told you to go use XYZ Home Inspection Company? If you use them, they did an okay job, and then later you found out that I get $100 for every client I send to them, would that maybe make a difference in how much you trust them and me? Maybe I didn't hook you up with them because they're the best, but because I'm getting paid from them and not the one down the street. So that's the reason doesn't allow kickbacks. It also restricts how much the lender can escrow for taxes and insurance. We're going to do some of that math tonight too. If the lender tells the closing attorney that they want to collect 3 months for insurance and 4 months for taxes so that they can set up the escrow account for the borrower so that when those bills come due later in the year for the whole life of the loan, there's enough there for sure because there's a cushion in place. It's to set up that cushion. But lenders are in the business of loaning money. And if you let them, they'll take as much money from you as they can so that they can turn around and loan it out to others. So they are restricted. They can't use escrow as a reason to collect on a ridiculous amount of money from the borrower, only enough to handle that goal of having a decent, modest cushion in the escrow account. So it restricts how much you can collect, lenders can collect. Fast forward to the 2008 stuff, and another upgrade to RESPA was this. Before this upgrade, this update and this change, lenders told borrowers what their fees would be using a document that they labeled a good faith estimate. We don't have that anymore. They changed the name of it to just loan estimate. So GFE, good faith estimate, went away because every lender's good faith estimate looked different, and it was confusing to borrowers. They couldn't make sense of it. They couldn't easily see that, yes, this lender A charges a 4% interest rate while lender B, C, and D charge at 5%. And why is that? It wasn't immediately obvious that lender A is making that 4% rate possible because they're charging discount points, for instance. You would have had to rely on your agent, read the fine print, just find it somehow, stumble upon it. It was somewhere buried in the paperwork. Now you can't hide behind it. We looked at it together, right? We looked at the loan estimate and we compared it to the closing disclosure. They're very similar because that way you could see what they promised you in the beginning and compare it to what they delivered to you, the borrower, at the end. And so when it comes to delivery of the loan estimate and the closing disclosure, what's the magic number of days required for disclosing these two separate documents? What's required of the lender in disclosing the loan estimate, for instance? They must share that with the borrower no later than when? 3 days, but after what? 3 days after what? 3 days after a certain event, a certain thing takes place.
Is it the due diligence period?
No, but that's a pretty good guess. All this is happening during that, you bet. But it specifically has to do with the loan itself. 3 days after what event related to the actual loan process? What starts the whole process?
Loan application.
Yes, that's it. 3 days after loan application date, lender must give borrower the LE, the loan estimate. And then we also saw what constitutes this loan application date. And what is that? Oh, thank you, Kathy. I just saw that. I got to keep looking at that chat a little better. What is that loan application date? That's the point at which the what has been disclosed. What have they borrowed money to buy? What is it? There it is. Thanks, Samuel. Yeah, the address of the property. So they're going to apply for the loan and say, this is to borrow money to buy this address. That now constitutes loan application. And that lender has a clock ticking. And they have to disclose and deliver this LE loan estimate to the borrower within 3 days of that loan application. They are also going to share with them a brochure called the Your Home Loan Toolkit, which pretty much says, here's how loans work. Don't stop paying. If you don't pay, you don't stay. It pretty much gives people a basic education on how mortgages work. We fast forward to closing, and this is under this monster acronym that's a combination of two acronyms. It's just 4 letters, TRID. I don't have it on here, but TRID stands for TILA RESPA Information Disclosure. TILA stands for Truth in Lending Act. RESPA stands for Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, Information Disclosure. And it says 3 days after loan application must give the borrower the LE, and then fast forward to closing. No later than 3 days before closing, you must give the borrower the proof that you delivered, which is the closing disclosure. That closing disclosure, if you remember, we looked at it together, has all the numbers on it. Any amount of money that is either given or taken from buyer and or seller is recorded, reflected, and signed off on the closing disclosure. There's one for the buyer, and then there's another one for the seller. Used to be that it wasn't called a closing disclosure. We always used one document. If you ever hear maybe an old agent say HUD-1 form, the HUD-1 form. And that pretty much accomplished the same thing, but everybody saw everybody else's stuff from both sides. We still have it. The HUD-1 form is still used, but not for loans. It's used when it's a cash deal. Because in cash deals, you don't have to worry about 3 days before closing because there's no loan that RESPA oversees. Does that make sense? Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act is about loans and lenders, but when you pay cash, there's no lender. Therefore, we're not going to use the loan estimate or the closing disclosure. We're just going to have a closing statement, settlement statement, or something like that, and it's going to be called a HUD-1 form. You're probably not going to be tested on HUD-1 forms, but the vast majority of purchases involve loans. Therefore, we do need to know how they work. You'll be running into it a lot. On the LE and the CD, there are 3 categories. The tolerances, right? There's a zero tolerance category, which is pretty much within the lender's full control. The lender has full control over what they choose to charge people. Therefore, they're held fully responsible for actually coming through and charging them what they promised they would and no more. And therefore, if they do end up charging more, they have to absorb it and cover it themselves. The buyer doesn't have to. Zero tolerance, because it's the lender's fees that they choose to charge. If a borrower doesn't like those fees, they can shop around, find another lender. And then there's another category, the 10% tolerance category, which says the lender might give the borrower a list of things to choose from. And so it still has to do with the lender, but it's not the lender's direct fees. But since the lender's involved and is making recommendations, they are held to a standard. They're held to a tolerance responsibility of 10%. If they promise it's going to be $500 and it's really $551, then that's more than 10% over. So they're going to have to cover that extra dollar. They're going to have to cover whatever's over the 10% over. If it goes beyond the 500 by 10%, the borrower still has to pay for it. But if it goes beyond the 10%, then the lender covers it. And then finally, there's some things that the borrower can choose to hire, one of which is a home inspection. Lots of home inspections if they want to. None of that has to do with the lender. Lender doesn't require home inspections typically. The buyer's smart to have them done, but the lender therefore has no responsibility for what they cost. If the borrower chooses to hire an inspector that charges $1,500, they pay $1,500, not the lender, right? And those are outlined in their own place on the closing disclosure and the LE. We as brokers need to verify information. What sort of information are we verifying under RESPA? RESPA says you better double check, make sure these things are right. What sorts of things are we as brokers responsible to make sure are correct? Where do they come from? Think about that same document that informs the deed. That's what we have to do with. What document is that? Yeah. Pretty much the contract, the negotiations, which could have also included warranties being paid for. Oh, the repairs needed to be done, and part of that repair negotiation is the seller agrees to pay $3,000 for the buyer's closing costs. That would need to be double checked. The broker needs to make sure that the attorney knows about it, for one thing, has the documentation to prove that that was agreed upon, and includes it on the closing disclosure. So anytime somebody comes up with an idea of money changing hands between buyer and seller, what's the first question that should be asked by a broker? If somebody says, hey, let's get the seller to pay $3,000 toward buyer's closing costs instead of fixing it, what do we need to double check first before we go that route? It's my definition of the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. Who has the gold in this situation?
The buyer.
Not if they're getting a loan. Who has more gold than the buyer?
The lender.
You got it. That's it. So we've got to check with the lender. It's up to the lender to say if they will allow the seller to pay $3,000 toward the buyer's closing costs. That's what I'm getting to. So anytime there's a question of buyer giving seller something, seller giving buyer something, and there is a loan in place, there's a loan that needs to be approved, the lender needs to be informed. And if we hide something from the lender and don't put a dollar figure, something that is being changing hands between the parties, if we don't include that on the closing disclosure, what could we be guilty of?
Willful admission.
Yes, true. That's what the real estate commission would call it. And what else would it be called that could lead to Martha Stewart prison?
Breach of contract.
Getting there. It involves the L word. Looking to see if I have a slide for it. It's big bad, the big bad wolf in this transaction, and that is loan fraud. Loan fraud. We have committed loan fraud if we don't tell the lender the money that's changing hands. That's what the purpose of the CD is, to make sure the lender has full transparency, full disclosure. We're disclosing to the lender what the parties are doing, that the parties are giving money to each other above and beyond this, just the contract. Because it's quite common for somebody to have an idea that the buyer is going to get money from the seller or from an agent. But if the buyer's asking the lender, will you please loan me money? Do you think it's fair that that lender knows from where that buyer is getting any money? Yeah, because it affects their ability to repay the lender, right? So the lender should care, and they do care, that the buyer is getting maybe a rebate from the agent or money from a seller. We certainly cannot stand by as brokers while the seller's agent maybe proposes that, hey, you know what, let's just keep this clean. Anytime they say that phrase, you need to perk your ears up, because they're probably about to propose that they meet in the parking lot before closing and write a check or pass along some cash, because they don't want to put it on the loan or on the closing disclosure. That means loan fraud. Lender needs to see every dollar that goes back and forth between the parties, especially. So that's a big one. What happens if we violate RESPA? Not loan fraud, but this is the penalty for violating RESPA. That is a $10,000 per violation. Do you remember what the loan fraud one was? What's the maximum dollar amount for committing loan fraud? It's bigger, much bigger.
Isn't it like 30 or 50 years?
Yes, 30 years imprisonment compared to this 1 year for RESPA. And then what about the dollar amount by 2 zeros? Up to not 10,000 per violation, but $1 million for loan fraud. That's how serious it is. So big deal. That's a big deal. That brings us to how to prepare the settlement statement, and you won't have to do it. You won't have to. They're not going to give you a closing disclosure form like we saw and say fill in the blank. They'll do that in post. You will have to do that in 302. The good news is in real life you don't ever have to do it. You just need to check the math, but you don't have to say the interim interest is $400 and it needs to go here on the closing disclosure. You know, that's not real life. And so some of us in the educator field wonder why they're doing that to you in post, because it's really not something in the job description. You do need to know how to check it. So I guess I see the point in making sure you know how to do the math and where it should go. But for pre-licensing, all you have to do is know the calculations. And that starts here. It's just like a basic checking account. If we're taking money away from you, we are debiting you. So you and I go out to lunch together. Maybe it's a little hole in the wall place that doesn't take credit cards, and I brought cash and you didn't. And so you say, oh no, I don't have any cash on me. And I'll say, that's fine. You can just pay me back later. And so I pay with cash. Now at this point, you owe me your half, right? So you would be debited. If we were going to put this on a closing statement, we would say, okay, now it's time for you to pay me, but while you owe me, you're going to be debited $15, right? Got to take it from you. So that's what's happening here. The seller is going to be debited, and they're also going to receive some money in some cases. What's probably the biggest line item that the seller is credited? Seller is credited what amount? What's the biggest one? That's pretty obvious. So obvious that it might not be obvious.
The amount for the house.
You got it. Yeah, that purchase price. That's the big fat credit on the seller's side. They're getting the price. And so conversely, what's a big debit on the buyer's side? Same.
Paying for the house.
Same thing. Yeah. And so if we saw it on a very simple sheet, like a very rudimentary sheet, we would say sales price that's CD, credit and debit. So sales price, let's go down a little further. On the buyer's side is going to be a debit for $230,000, and on the seller's side it's going to be a credit for $230,000. And so this is the kind of thing that you can make for yourself on your scratch paper for some of the problems that might be helpful, especially there's going to be a big, what I call monster problem, at least one, maybe two. And they're going to give you this whole long paragraph of all of these expenses. And the final question, the actual question on that is how much either the money the buyer's bringing or the money the seller's getting. So it might be a monster question which results in calculate what the buyer needs to bring to closing. Or it could say calculate what the seller will walk away with at closing. And I call it the monster question because you've got to go through and do 5 or 6 or 8 different calculations in order to get this final calculation or this one. But don't worry, it's okay. It's just a lot of little things to add up to this big thing. And I would also suggest that you save it. Some of you might be the kind that just embraces the challenge and you refuse to be defeated. Don't put 15, 20 minutes into this particular problem if you haven't made your way through the bulk of the test yet. I figure they'll probably place this one toward the end anyway, but be careful. Don't give this too much more time than it deserves. Right? They all count the same amount of points. So I wouldn't hate for you to suck up 20 minutes of time on something that's going to give you the same number of points as what is the definition of real property, for instance. Okay, so buyers debited $230 and sellers credited $230 for the sale price. We also know about excise tax. And we already discovered that that's a seller debit. And in this case, it's going to be $460. We'll figure out how to do that math later. This one was pretty easy to do. And then we know that, the deed preparation. Some of the items here are just going to be told to you. You don't need to calculate them. So on your scratch paper, you could be going down through and identifying the ones that they just give you. Deed prep, they'll say attorney charges $300 for deed prep. And we know that the seller needs to pay deed preparation. So we would just write it over there. What about earnest money? How does earnest, did you notice that we have some items that are only on one side, not both? So earnest money is one of those. Earnest money is going to count on whose side as what? The buyer gave it. They wrote a check for it back at the under contract phase. But who has it? Where does it exist?
With the trust holder.
Yeah, the one holding and it could be the broker, it could be the attorney. But all we know so far, all that's happened is that the buyer has given it. And if they've given it, they deserve to get it back. It's a credit to the buyer. let's call it $1,000. It's a buyer credit. That's it. Earnest money is a buyer credit. And then that other thing that you put up front was due diligence money. How are we counting due diligence money? This one's a little different. What happened with the due diligence money? Who gave it to who?
The buyer gave it to the seller.
Yeah. So who has it in their possession? Seller's got it. Buyer gave it up, but we also know that the buyer is going to get it back as a credit. It will be credited to their side. It's that much less money they need to bring to the closing table. Let's call it $2,000. So in this case, it's $2,000 credited to the buyer because they've already written the check for it. And it's been in the possession of the seller this whole time as non-refundable deposit money. So we've got to do a special step here. Otherwise, if we handle it the way it's written right now on the screen, we will end up giving the seller $2,000 twice. So therefore, for the paperwork purpose, we need to debit it from the seller's column. If we don't, then we've given them $4,000 instead of $2,000. That might take a minute to wrap your mind around. And you might need to just store it in that place that you store things that you just accept as truth, like 4 little old ladies going 35 and a 60. Here's what we do. Don't even worry about why. The logic of why is not that important. Just know that this is the answer. In a closing disclosure, how do we count due diligence money? It's a credit to the buyer and a debit to the seller. If we don't debit the seller, then we end up giving it to them twice. Just accept it and move on with life. If you're struggling with that, don't worry about the why so much. Just accept it. What else? We've got, here's a big one. The loan amount. Loan amount for the buyer's new loan that they're borrowing. Where do we place the loan amount? That's tough, isn't it? Because you're thinking, well, wait a minute. They're going to have to prepay this thing every month for 30 years. So isn't it a buyer debit because they're having to pay out? Well, that's the next step, right? That's phase 2. But keep in mind, we're only talking about closing day. We need to come up with what we do with these numbers as of closing day. And don't worry about what comes after closing day. But as of closing day, that lender is giving the buyer the loan amount. The buyer's not literally getting it. They're getting credit for it. The money is ending up going to the seller, but it is essentially a credit to the buyer, which they immediately give over to the seller, and then over the next 30 years, they're going to pay it back a month at a time, right? So the loan amount is a credit on the buyer's side. And if you'll notice, this is not a complete list, but we will never see on this list, on the closing disclosure itself, an item called down payment. That will not be on there. But take it right back off because we don't need it. We don't need to put a special line item called down payment, because if we have the loan amount and the sale price and we do the math, it's already mathematically factored in, right? If we have a buyer debit of $230 that they're paying and then a credit of $200 that they're getting from the lender, it already mathematically has that $30,000 down payment. That makes sense? So if they were to ask you on the test, kind of like a trick, they won't. I can't imagine they'd do it this way. They would not. It's not going to be, where does down payment go on the closing disclosure? It really doesn't. It's handled because of these two entries put in separately, because automatically we account for the down payment. let's get back to the actual slide deck here. Gave you kind of a sneak peek. I think it's useful to figure out, like, think together, make you proactively think, what would I do if I needed to figure out how closings should work? And I think it's useful to think, where does this money need to go? I think it sticks a little better. Now, debits. So we're going to have a debit for the seller and the buyer, some of them. We're going to have credits for sellers and buyers. Sometimes, though, and this is a lot of what we're going to calculate tonight, there are a few items that are both debits and credits at the same time. It's a debit from one side and a credit to the other side for one amount of money. And that's what this proration is. We're prorating because they're closing as of day of closing. We need to take $350 from the buyer and give it to the seller, or vice versa, depending on whatever the issue is. So it's a fee split between the parties because it's something we need to get from one side and give to the other, depending on when they owned it and how they owned it. Here are the fees we left off with the other night. We know some of these. Loan fees, what the lender charges, and who pays them. All of this whole page should be, I have to double check as we go, all of these should be buyer fees. Loan fees. Give me a couple of examples of loan fees. What are some lender fees? Things we calculated in chapter 14 and 15. What's that lender charge? You can speak out. You can put it in the chat. It's actually on here listed separately, by the way. Which ones of these are also called loan fees? The lender charges them. There's that fee the lender charges to originate the loan, called the origination fee, right? And then there's, depending on the situation, perhaps discount points. So those are two examples of loan fees right here. Anything else the lender might charge for the privilege of making that loan to that borrower would be included in that category. Attorney fees for the buyer. For your information, the attorney fee is probably going to be more than the one for the seller because they're doing more things for the buyer, especially when they're handling a loan package. And what you'll probably see on these test questions for attorney fees, maybe $500, $600, $800. In real life, they tend to go between $900 to $1,400, depending on the attorney and where they're located. An uptown Charlotte or Raleigh attorney is going to probably charge more than a smaller town on the outskirts attorney might. Just seems to be that way. Reserves for taxes and reserves for insurance. That's the whole setting up the escrow account thing. So that are going to be the responsibility. Those are going to be the responsibility of the buyer, because anything that the lender charges or requires has to be paid by the buyer. The appraisal fee, let's figure out what this is worth. The lender wants to know what it's worth. And so the lender requires it to be appraised. Therefore, the buyer pays for it because it's the buyer who is benefiting from getting this loan. Inspections, interim interest. We talked about recording. Deed prep is not the same as deed recording. If you see the word deed, that's not going to be enough to spur your memory on who pays what. Because recording fees, what are we talking about? Tell me, speak out, somebody. What do I mean by recording fees? What sorts of things are recorded as a result of a transaction?
The deed itself.
Yeah, that's a good one. The deed itself, and another thing, if it's a loan, what's another document that will be recorded. You're halfway there with the same word. The deed is the title, and the other one that gets recorded is the thing that pledges that property as collateral, also known as a, there it is, thank you, deed of trust. The deed and the deed of trust both get recorded. What are we talking about? Maybe 50 bucks, if that. Not much. Recording fees, that's literally the fee you have to pay to the Register of Deeds office in order for them to put it on the public record, which is what recording is. Survey fee. Buyers should always be encouraged by you, their broker, to have a survey, because if they don't, the buyer doesn't get a survey at time of purchase, then their title insurance policy will not cover encumbrance-related problems that could occur later. Why? Well, because if they had gotten the survey, the encumbrances would have been revealed. Therefore, the title insurance policy could cover them because it's much less likely that they're even going to come up. That's the logic behind it. Buyer fee. This is we have due diligence fee here. That's not something that they're paying. It's something that they're getting a credit for, but they did pay it up front at the time they went under contract. But this is going to be a credit to the buyer. But pretty much all the rest of these, I need to make that obvious. Put a little note there. The rest of these things are all debits to the buyer. That'd be a better way to say it for most of them. And then on the seller's side, not as many line items. That's why it only takes 15 or 20 minutes for the seller to sign off on their closing disclosure. They're in and out, usually first. Attorney brings them in first, they sign off, they're out, they're gone. Broker, you too. You listing agent, you and your seller are out of there, and then you're just thinking, I hope everything goes well for the buyer side, and they take 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how many questions the buyer agent and their client. So the seller fees include, of course, the commission, because usually it's the seller paying it. The excise tax, we know that. Attorney fees, which probably are going to pretty much be the deed preparation for the purposes of this test. I doubt they're going to list out attorney fees to the seller. The deed prep is pretty much the attorney fee to the seller. That's about it. The prorations, now all of those were clearly mostly debits to the individual parties. Now we're getting a little more complicated, because that seller has lived there from January 1st up to the day of closing. Why does that matter? Because they're the ones responsible for taxes from January 1st through the day of closing. But then the buyer is going to be the owner from day after closing through end of year, so they're responsible for taxes the rest of the time. So property tax is one of the big ones that possibly will be prorated. There are actually 3 different ways to handle property taxes, and they depend on when in the year the closing takes place. So it depends on when you're closing as to how the taxes need to be handled. Let's look at it. Here's our timeline. January 1st, all the way to December 31st. Okay, whole year. What do we know about property tax and when it is due? When's property tax due? When can you start paying it? When could you pay it if you were really just that kind of person that pays their bills ASAP? Can't pay it on January 1st for the given year. We'll say again?
September.
Yeah. September 1st. Notice that is not halfway. That is clearly beyond the halfway point of the year. So you can't even pay this year's, let's just call it 2022. You can't even pay this year's property tax until September 1st. So what if you close before September 1st? Let's just say April 3rd, my birthday. It's a good year. Oh, April 3rd is today. It's a good day. April 3rd is our closing day. Closing day. When we have that closing, can the attorney collect the taxes that are due and go ahead and send them into the government? No. Government doesn't want them. They're not collecting them until September 1st. So how would, any guesses how would you handle taxes? We've got the seller's side, we've got the buyer's side. We've got credits and debits for each. How would you handle, let's just call this, let's just say that it's $1,500 represents this amount of time in the year. The whole entire tax bill is $4,500. And so $1,500 represents January 1st through April 3rd. And then from April 4th through end of year, it's $3,000 for a total of $4,500 for the whole year. So in other words, one party, buyer or seller, you tell me which, is responsible for $1,500 and the other party is responsible for $3,000. Who's responsible for $1,500 of the taxes this year?
Seller's responsible for 1,500.
Yeah, because they lived there when that $1,500 was being accrued, so to speak, to use a vocabulary word we picked up last week. Seller lived there from January 1 through April 3rd. Therefore, seller is responsible for $1,500, and therefore they need to be debited $1,500. And the buyer is responsible for the rest of it. But here's the thing. If we're closing before September 1st, we cannot turn the money in. The attorney can't send it in yet. The government won't take it. It's not able to be processed. So let's just give that $1,500 to the buyer's side. We're taking it from the seller. We're giving it to the buyer's side. If they were to take that $1,500 and go to Jamaica and blow it and not have any to pay their tax bill, how does that affect closing day? It doesn't. It's the buyer's problem that we don't need to worry about. You with me? So we just need to get that money over to their side and let them and their lender deal with it and worry about it later. None of our business what they do or don't do with it. We hope they pay their taxes. We don't want them to have problems later. But when it's a closing that's happening before September 1st, the fact that the buyer is responsible for $3,000 is irrelevant. We don't even need to calculate that. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all when the closing is before September 1st. The only figure that matters is how much the seller is responsible for. And in this case, it's $1,500. We just need to take that from the seller and give it to the buyer so that they can combine it with their $3,000 when it's come time to pay it and send in the entire $4,500 to the government. You with me? Now, what probably is going to happen is the buyer's lender is going to want to send that payment in to make sure it gets done, right? So all that we really have accomplished is let's take money from the seller, throw it over the fence to the buyer, and we've handled it. As of day of closing, that's all you got to do when it's a closing happening before September 1st. So that's one. We come back from break, we'll talk about the other two possible ways that we need to handle the closing, and I'll give you a hint. It's going to be anytime we're closing September 1st or after, there's two possible ways to handle it. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Welcome back. Okay. Now let's talk about, forgive my, that's really oompa loompa looking, isn't it? There we go. I was just remarking on how much I look like an oompa loompa in this camera angle. See if I can get that fixed at the break. Anyway, so one situation, one possibility of property tax was closing here. The other two possibilities are closing September 1st or after. We've got to handle it. There's, again, remember, 3 different ways that we handle property tax, and we've talked about one of them. That was here, and it was a seller debit, buyer credit for what amount? The seller's portion. That's one of the ways. Now let's look at the 2 possibilities for a September 1st or after. Now we're closing somewhere in here. Let's call it October. We'll say we're going to have a closing on October 2nd. Closing October 2nd. Here's the question. Has the seller paid the property taxes yet? That's what it depends on. How we handle the closing when it's September 1st or after depends on whether or not the seller has paid the taxes for the year. Let's say that they have. Let's say that the seller is my wife. As soon as the bill is due, she's going to pay it. I'm not quite the same way. So let's say the seller has paid the taxes for the whole year. That means that for this whole year, $4,500 have been paid. We determined, we're going to use the same numbers from that last time. $4,500 per year is the total annual tax bill. That is out. Sellers paid it. But the seller's not going to be the owner for this amount of time. Now this time, let's just say that when we do our calculation, dollars worth of this amount of time, let's just call it, we'll call it $800. We're going to go over how to calculate that, but I just want to show you how to attribute it first, and then we'll talk about how to come up with the dollar amount it actually is later. So this $800 covers the amount of time, not from October 2nd to the end of the year, but from October 3rd through the end of the year. Because who is responsible for paying for the day of closing when it comes to almost everything? Certainly taxes. Try again. It's the seller. The buyer is pretty much only for the interim interest calculation. But for property taxes and almost every other kind of calculation that we do in closing, seller pays for day of closing. Seller is responsible for day of closing. Okay? So that seller, let's say if $800 is this amount of time from October 3rd through end of year, then it's $4,500 minus the $800. So the first part, all the way up to and including day of closing, is $3,700. So how do we credit it? How do we attribute it, I should say? We know our dollar amounts. We just need and this could be a test question. They may not test you on how to find out the 800 or the 37. They may just want to know who's responsible for which number. So that's what I'm asking you now. We're closing October 2nd. Seller has paid the entire year's worth of taxes. How will the taxes be counted? I'm going to give you some options. It's one of these. Oops. Okay, good. You can still see it. It's one of these choices. First choice is, are we debiting the seller and crediting the buyer for $800? Or are we debiting the seller, crediting the buyer for the other amount, the $3,700? Or are we crediting the seller and debiting the buyer for the $800? Or crediting the seller, debiting the buyer for the $3,700? So first question is, are we taking away or giving to the seller? You tell me. Somebody's already told me. Anybody else? Seller's paid the whole year. They're out of pocket for the whole year, but they're not going to be the owner for the whole year. So Kathy says we need to credit the seller and give them back some money. We need to give them back the amount of money that represents the time that they're no longer the seller. And she's right. Rebecca too. Number 3, we're crediting the seller and we're taking from the buyer, debiting the buyer for the buyer's portion. That's how we handle it. This is a proration, just like that last one was a proration, where we're taking one amount and giving that same amount to the other, taking from one, giving to the other. And again, it's because the seller is out of pocket for the entire year's taxes. We need to make it fair, right? To give them back some money, like if you go out with your friend and they pay for the meal and because you didn't have the money, you need to make it up to them later. You with me? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's do it this way. Here we go. Now, here's our January 1 through December 31st. Here's our September. Let's do the same. What was that last one? It was October 2nd. Okay. Which one? The last question? Oh, the one we just did? Your question is, this is what we need to do with at the closing day in order to make it fair. How we need to handle taxes on day of closing, on the closing disclosure, because we're closing October 2nd and because the seller has paid the whole year. Does that make sense? Is that the answer to what you're asking? Okay, good. Now, 2 out of 3. We've done 2 out of 3. Let's do the last one. Let's figure out how to do the last one. October 2nd is our closing. September 1st, as usual, is when taxes can be paid. The total is $4,500 for the whole year. But this time, the seller is me. And the seller has not paid the taxes for the year yet. And that is okay. I'm not going to be charged a penalty until I get past December 31st. But if I'm closing on October 2nd and I've not paid the taxes for the year at all, there's a very specific and different way we handle it. In fact, the way we handle it when the seller has not paid is not a proration at all. Write that down. If the seller has not paid the taxes for the year and we're closing after September 1st, we do not handle it with a proration. Because there's 2 chunks of money. We know that. We did that already. There's the 37 that represents the amount of time up to and including October 2nd, from January 1 through October 2nd. And then there's the buyer portion of responsibility for the October 3rd through end of year. The way we have to handle it would not be proper to give the seller a credit because they still owe their own money. The seller owes $3,700. They haven't paid taxes yet. The buyer is also on the hook for taxes. And guess what? We're closing after September 1st, so it's available to be paid. Therefore, the way we handle it is to debits. We're going to debit the seller's portion. In this case, $3,700. And we're also going to debit the buyer their portion. So it's two questions. What do you do with the money, debit or credit? And then what amount are you debiting or crediting? In this case, it's a debit to both sides for their respective amounts. Because if we give either party the amount from the other, it's just unnecessary. The bill needs to be paid, so they're just going to take the amounts from each side. They both add up to the full year's bill, and now we're done, right? It definitely gets done. The buyer's new lender is happy because they know the taxes are paid. They were always worried about the taxes getting paid. The seller's happy because that needs to happen anyway, and they don't have to do it themselves. The attorney will do it. Because all of these debits and credits, the attorney is processing them, and they're going to send out these payments. They're going to cut a check to the brokers for the commission owed. They're going to cut a check to the government for the taxes due. The attorney's going to cut a check to the homeowners association for any dues that are outstanding that need to be settled up at closing. If a home warranty needs to be paid, the attorney's going to say, hey, give us the invoice for that warranty, and we'll take from the proceeds of the sale, and whoever's supposed to pay for it, we will cut that check, collect it from the right person, and cut the check ourselves and send it in. All of those things, what you're paying the attorney for. They're making sure all of these third parties get paid. So that's what's happening behind the scenes. So this is not a proration at all. A proration would involve a credit, and there's no credit. We're not taking from one and giving to the other the same amount. We're taking from each one different amounts. That's how you know it's not a proration. And again, the reason why is because it's available to be paid. We're closing after September 1st, and the seller hasn't paid it yet. So let's just keep it nice and clean in a good way and make sure it gets paid. Now you're done for the year. Now the buyer can pick it up from 2023 forward. You with me? Okay, to recap. Here is the difference. Here's our September 1. Here's our December 31st. Here's our January 1. And if we are closing, let's make it nice and color-coded. Anytime in here, up to, but not including September 1st, then it's going to be a debit seller, credit buyer, the seller's portion. If it is instead a closing here, and the seller has paid the whole year's taxes, then it's going to be a credit seller, debit buyer, the buyer's portion. And then if it is closing somewhere in this same period, but the seller has not paid, it's going to be a debit seller and a debit buyer, their respective portions. Good? Screen cap that if you can read it. I don't know if the colors show up so well. They're not showing up on that screen as well as they're showing up down here. So this is that one. This is this one. And then this is the last one. Probably made it worse. Now, let's do an entire actual problem as you might see it. Now that we know how to attribute it, here's what it might say. It might say something like this. Just give me a second here. Gotta have some thinking music. Okay. Sale price, we'll call it $375. Taxed. Tax value or assessed value is 75% of market value. Back in the day, remember when we used to do those? The tax rate, oh my gosh, he's doing this to us. What a jerk. Is 11 mils. We're closing on March 17th. Take time, figure out how the taxes will be reflected on the closing disclosure. I'll be right back. How do we do? What was step one here? Good job. 75 times 75 to get our tax value, and hopefully you got that to be 281, 250. Now we know what the tax value is. We know what the rate of taxes is. So we're going to multiply them together. We also need to divide that mils by 1,000. You can actually do that at any point, and it'll still work. 3,093.75 is the whole year's tax bill. And then to get the daily taxes, divide that by 360. $8.59 per day. Oops. You know what I meant. Get rid of that so it's not confusing. turns into that. Now, we need to figure out our days. This is something that can get people in trouble. Adding up the days can be problematic. So, here's a couple ways to do it. And this one is not bad because you're so close to the front of the year. So, it's really just January and February that are 2 full months, right? Each 30 days, and plus 17 days of March. So if you add up those 3 together, we've got 77 days, right? If we were like later in the year and you don't want to add up like 8 or 9 or 10 months, another way to think of it is this. Which month is March? It's the 3rd month. So that means there are 2 months at 30 days each, which means 60 total days. So if you were like, we were way off into like November, then you would say, well, November is our month of closing. That's 10 entire months before November at 30 days each, right? In this case, it's only 2 months at 30 days each, plus the 17, which includes the day of closing, for a days to seller of 77. And because, again, it is closing before September 1st, we're going to be debiting the seller and crediting the buyer the seller's portion, which just leaves one little bit of math, 77 days times $8.59. So the entry on the closing disclosure would be for $661.43 on the debit column of the seller and on the credit column of the buyer. Does that make sense? No mystery there. That was not bad. It's the one when we're September 1st or after that you have to keep track of whether it's gotten paid or not that can sometimes be a little confusing. Here we go. Okay. Now, let's change it up a little bit. We've got our taxes. We know our total for the year 30. Let me do it this way. 3090. I'm going to do it so that we're checking on procedure, not numbers. So we know the whole year's taxes are $3093.75 or $859 per day. All right. Now, this time we're closing everything else the same. But we're closing on November 19th, and the seller has not paid the taxes. Take a moment. Tell me what we need to do about that. How would this be reflected on the closing disclosure? Okay, so seller has not paid. We're definitely debiting the seller. What else? What's the rest of it? Careful though. Whole year. Here's the whole year. Here's our closing day. Yeah, we need to. The taxes for the year have not been paid, and it's after September 1st. Then they are available to be paid. Therefore, we need to debit them both their respective amounts. Need to debit the seller their portion and debit the buyer their portion. So what are the portions? What's this piece Oops. Let me make this a little more clear. Here's what it would look like graphically. November 19th is our closing. So up to and including closing is the seller's portion. And then the rest of the year is the buyer's portion. So how many, here's the other thing. If you need to calculate days, this is big, write this one down. When calculating days, always calculate seller days and then work with that as needed. Calculate seller days. You would be tempted in this exact kind of problem to say, well, November 19th, that's almost at the end of the year. It's much easier and quicker to just say December has 30 days and then the rest of November. It's very tempting to do that. But the problem is, I would almost bet every time that at some point you're going to screw up the day of closing and forget to count it. If you go backwards and count backwards from December 30, from December back, you will probably lose track of the day of closing and get it wrong. Because while the test question probably won't give you two answers that are only a rounding error apart, they very likely will give you two answer choices that are a day of closing apart. They very likely will give you two choices that are a day of closing apart. I repeated that on purpose. You got to know who pays for day of closing. That's a highly testable item component of this particular type of problem. So the only way to ironclad almost guarantee you'll never lose track of day of closing is to just always calculate seller days, even if it's most of the year. So in this case, we need to calculate, what is it, November 19th? Well, how many months before November? November's the 11th month. That means there are 10 pen issues. What the heck? There we go. Yeah, sure thing. Where was I? So we need to calculate the seller's days. So if we're closing on November 19th, which month in the year is November? It's the 11th month, right? This is 11/19. That means there are 10 months with 30 days in them that you need to count up to, right? Plus the ones in November. So 19 days in November plus 300 days for the year up to then. You with me? So just go back to the amount of full months we're dealing with plus however many days. See what's happening? This is sort of a twofold thing. Most important part is all we have to do is add up whatever the day of closing is for the month, right? 19. So 319 days to seller. There's no way to screw that up and lose track of the days. So if we know that the seller's days are 319, and what was our dollars per day, I left it in the calculator, $8.59. Then the seller's portion that they are responsible for is $27.40 and 21 cents. And if you know that the total is, where'd it go? Total was $30.93.75. Just subtract the seller's portion in dollars. And there you go. That gives us the buyer's portion. So just do it that way. Trust me, it's the best way to avoid forgetting to put the closing day on the responsibility of the seller. We need to include the day of closing for what the seller owes. And so it's really tempting when we have a closing day close to the end of the year to not do it, but do it. Promise. It's better. And then once you again know the dollars to either of them, subtract that from the total dollars to get the dollars to the other. You don't have to figure out how many days to the buyer. All you because if the question is asking about dollars, and that's all they ever care about, is the taxes themselves, not the days of taxes so much. Does that make sense? Count the days of seller. And then that just leaves the other possibility. Then we'll move on. This time we're closing November, what did I say, 19th? Still closing November 19th. But the seller has paid the taxes for the whole year. They've paid the entire $3,093.75 tax bill for the whole year. So what do we need to do in this situation? Good. But for how much? Whose portion? Let's ask it that way. The buyer's portion, right? Because here's how it looks on the timeline. Here's our closing. We've got buyer's portion and seller's portion. Seller has paid the whole year. We need to give them back this part, the buyer's portion. So we did that math already. I'm not going to make you do that again. So the portions are these. This time it's going to be $353.54. The buyer, that's what the buyer's portion is. So credit seller, debit buyer. If that's, yeah, $353.54. We okay there? That is taxes. Again, it's only proration on 2 of the 3 possible scenarios for taxes. Because this last one, or the one we just did before this, was debit from both. Now let's look at it in the slides here. We know a month has 30 days, a year has 360 days. At the bottom of the slide, seller owns day of closing. Seller has to pay for day of closing all the time, every time. Every time the seller's involved, let's say it that way. Because interim interest, the seller's not involved. Therefore, the seller does not pay day of closing. They have nothing to do with it. It's between the buyer and their lender when it's interim interest. That's why that's at the bottom here. The buyer pays for day of closing on interim interest. Well, Neil, that doesn't sound fair. What if they close at 3:30 in the afternoon? They're not getting a full day. Welcome to the loan. Welcome to the family. We're so glad you chose us to borrow money from. We want the whole day, right? It's that sort of thing. And then we learned this by doing. I like to kind of learn it by doing, but let's go back and hit the highlights. Calculate the seller fees first. Subtract that from the total to end up with the buyer's fees. That's the only way to make sure you don't screw up the day of closing and who's responsible for it. So step 1, whether it's taxes or interest for loans, notice that there's some similarities. There's a rate for the taxes, which we just did to get the annual tax bill. I need to change that word rate to bill. Need to multiply the tax rate times the tax value. And if you notice, it correlates to the loan. To get the annual interest of the loan, it's the interest rate times the loan amount gives you the annual dollars of interest. And then to get a daily amount, I get that rate out of there. I didn't put that in there. That needs to be dividing it by 360. Or if it's a monthly, we need to divide by 30. This will make more sense when we get into those specific problems. When we're doing a January 1st to day of closing, it's going to be a debit seller, credit buyer. Whenever we figure out who pays what and it's a proration, we need to come up with not only who's paying, who's debited, who's credited, but also in what amounts. Is it the seller's amount or the buyer's amount? And then here's what it looks like in a neater format. If it's a January 1st through August 31st, up to not including September 1st, if it's closing in that time frame, it's going to be debiting the seller, crediting the buyer for the seller's portion. If we're closing September 1st through December 31st and the taxes have been paid, it's going to be a credit seller, debit buyer. Sorry, that's for taxes have been paid. And then if they have not been paid, it's going to be a debit to both for their respective amounts. We okay? All right, let's see here. Let's do a couple of other scenarios. All right. All right, I'm going to give you one. I'm going to work through it together here. Let's say we have a closing in August 23rd. Earnest money of $3,000. Due diligence money of $4,000. Purchase price or sales price is $630,000. The loan to value ratio is 90%. At a 6% rate. The lender charges a loan origination fee of 1.5%. The buyer wants to get their rate down. So the discount points that it's going to cost for them to get the rate down to what they want, he needs to buy 3 discount points. He needs to buy 3 points. Property is taxed, or the assessed value is 85% of the market value. Homeowners insurance is $830 per year. We haven't talked about that yet. HOA dues are $4,300 a year, and they're paid monthly. And then we need to calculate interim interest. So, what does the buyer need to bring? What's the buyer need to bring to closing to pay for all these things, to pay for the things they're responsible for? Give you some time to do that. That will overlap into our break. We'll still have a break, of course, and we'll come back and keep going. But for now, for the next until 7:30 break time, work on that. Make a chart. Figure out buyer debits and credits. You want it to look like something like this. Buyer, make a debit column, make a credit column. And then just go down through the list. And given this information, we only need to know what what the buyer needs to pay for. By the way, we haven't talked about it, so let me mention this. When it's insurance, homeowners insurance, the homeowner insurance premium, the whole first year's premium, in this case $830, is a buyer debit. The buyer has to pay for the first year of insurance at closing. The buyer has to pay for the first year's insurance premium at closing. So I'll go ahead and tell you that homeowners insurance is going to be a debit to buyer for $830. And then HOA dues. We didn't talk about that, but besides that, I think we're good. HOA dues, $4,300 for the year. It's paid monthly. If it's $4,300 for the year, how much is it per month? HOA. So, wow. Went away altogether. Oh, it's updating. Great. Good timing. I need to buy this calculator. The free version is messing me up. 4,300 for the year divided by 12. Our HOA dues for the month is $358.33. When are we closing? Closing August 23rd. So all we need to worry about for HOA dues is the month. We don't need to worry about the whole year. We need to just figure out, okay, it's closing on the 23rd of the month and they're paid monthly. Let's say that they have not been paid yet. If they've not yet been paid and we're zooming into just this month of August, it's sort of like the taxes when they have not been paid, maybe. We need to figure out what the seller's responsible for. No, it's more like taxes when it's closing before September 1st. So seller's responsible for how many days in the month? 23, including the day of closing, because seller's always responsible for day of closing. So 23 days, and then how many dollars per day is the HOA? Well, it's $358 for the month. Divided by 30 is $11.94 per day times 23 days. For $274.62. That's the seller portion. So we're gonna debit the seller the $264.62 and debit the buyer their portion. That's if the seller has not yet paid them. But what if the seller has paid them? Then we're going to need to give back the seller the part that they're not going to be the owner. We need to give them back the part for the buyer, which in this case would be the difference between $358.33 and $274.62. Need to give them back $83.71 because the seller is out of pocket. And that's more likely the one you're going to see. Seller's paid for the whole month of closing, but we need to give them back the number of days the buyer is going to be the owner. After this month of closing, it doesn't matter. It's the buyer's problem. It has nothing to do with the seller because, again, all of these calculations are about what do we need to do as of the day of closing. So let's call it this. Let's say we need to credit the seller $83.71 and debit the buyer. Credit seller, debit buyer $83.71. So I'll fill that one in too. And since all we're worried about on this particular question is what the buyer needs to bring, we're not worried about the seller's side. We can just throw away that seller's side info altogether. We don't care about that for answering this question because we just need to answer what does the buyer need to bring. We still need to count the credits and the debits both because we're going to need to subtract one from the other at the end of all of this after we've made the entire column of each in order to end up with what that buyer needs to bring. You can go ahead and let's go ahead and take our break now. And then when you come back, I'll give you time to work on this yourself. You don't have to use your break for this, of course, unless you want to. So I'll see you in 10. We'll reconvene. I'll leave this up and just keep the time myself. So just keep going, work on this problem. I'll give you some time to work on that. And again, we're just looking for what the buyer needs to bring. For the taxes, you only need to be worried about the buyer's portion of taxes in order to answer this question, because that could be what they ask you on the test. It could just be all about the buyer's bringing what. It could also be about the seller is getting what, but not in this case. We're not doing that yet. So I'll give you some time. How we doing? Coming along? Just break it up into little pieces. So let's think about it. First of all, I like to, if I'm given a bunch of things like this, big monster problem like this, I'll just go right down through the list and maybe write the things that are easy, the things that are just given that don't require calculation. So if we make a pass of those, what do we do with earnest money? Where do we put earnest money in terms of the buyer? Is that a credit or a debit to the buyer? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kathy. That's a credit. So earnest money is $3,000 credited to the buyer. What about due diligence money? Another credit. Due diligence and earnest money are both credits to the buyer. They've written those checks at the beginning of as soon as it went under contract, and they are both credited to the buyer at closing day. What about sale price? What's that price? Which column will that price fall under for the buyer? It's a big fat debit, isn't it? Buyer's got to pay it. And then the next one, LTV. Sale price is a debit to the buyer, but the loan amount is a credit to the buyer. Can we figure out loan amount with this information? Sure. 630,000 times 90% LTV means a loan amount of 567. There's our loan amount under the credit column. Now, yes, over the next 30 years, the buyer will be paying for it over time, but as of the day of closing, they get it paid on their behalf. The lender comes along and puts in, not to the buyer, they don't give it, but to the attorney, they give the check for the loan amount, which will be used to disperse all the funds. Most of that loan amount will probably go to the seller toward the purchase price, right? It'll be a combination of loan amount and down payment. We don't need to identify down payment here because by having sale price and loan amount both on the statement, the down payment is mathematically accounted for. So we've got that. We're good so far. Origination fee, that's a pretty easy one, especially now that we have the loan amount. What's 1.5% of the loan amount? 8505 is what I'm getting. You getting that too? Looking at faces in the window. 8505 for origination fee. Do that one more time. That sounds right. Yeah. What we also could have done is instead of calculating 1.5% just for the origination fee, since this question is just asking what the buyer needs to bring, we could have handled both of these together. We don't need to know how much the rate was lowered on the discount points. We just need to know how much do 3 discount points cost. But since I've already done the origination fee by itself, I'll just do the additional 3 points for the discount points, which means 3% of the loan amount, which is another $17 and $10. $17,010. Okay. We're going to use this assessed value. We'll do the taxes in a minute. We've already accounted for the HO insurance, homeowner's insurance, and homeowner dues. And remember, the homeowner's insurance customarily is handled by paying the entire first year's premium. So whatever the insurance bill is for the whole year, add that as a debit on the buyer's side. They need to pay the whole first year. Simple. HOA dues, it's going to be seller has paid him for the month. How many days left in the month? Day after closing through the end of month is the buyer's portion, and that amount needs to come over to the seller, be credited to the seller. So that amount is a debit from the buyer's side for the HOA. And then interim interest. Let's do that over here. Interim interest. We have a closing on August 23rd, so we're worried about just 1 month. With interim interest, it's all about the month, not the year. How many days are left, including day of closing, when we close on August 23rd? Here's how to do it. 30 days in the whole month. Subtract the day of closing, which is the 23rd. That gives us 7 days. But that's just going to be the days after closing. We need to add another day to account for the day of closing. So when you're doing interim interest and you need to calculate the days left in the month, including day of closing, you need to remember to add 1 to it. Subtract the total in the month of 30. Subtract the day of closing from that to get the 7. Add another day to account for the day of closing. So 8 days of interim interest are required. And then do we have enough information here to calculate how much daily interest is? What's the daily interest? We know it's 8 days worth. We need to multiply that by the daily interest, but we need to figure that out. So we've got our loan to value ratio of 90% at a 6% interest rate. So we know our loan amount of $567. Loan amount times interest rate is annual interest, $34,020. That was the 567 times the 6% interest, $34,020. $34,020. That's for the year. Convert that to daily. Divided by 360. $94.50 per day times 8 days. So a total interim interest of $756. Where do we put that on the chart? A debit or a credit? That buyer needs to pay $756 for the privilege of living there the rest of the month of closing. So that's a debit. So we've done interim interest. Let's see what's left. Got everything? Taxes. Got to do taxes. Okay. I did not give you tax rate. Let me give you that. We know when we're closing. It's August 23rd. We know our assessed value. Therefore, we can figure out our tax value. So let's do a tax rate of $1.18 per hundred. $1.18 per hundred is the tax rate. Just that. It's city and county combined, $1.18 per hundred. With that information, let's figure out what we're going to need to do with the taxes to make this fair between buyer and seller. We've got, I think I just told you, $1.18 per hundred. What's the tax value? We've got a sale price of $630 and an assessed value of $85. So $630 times 85%. means a tax value of 535,500. Multiply that by the tax rate divided by 100. Gives us our annual taxes of $63,1890. Now that we know annual taxes, we can convert that to, what do we need? Monthly or daily? Need daily. So that becomes $17.55 per day. We're closing August 23rd. In the year, is August 23rd before September 1st? August, September, yeah, it's right there. So what do we do when we have a closing before September 1st? What are we gonna do with the money? Let's figure that out first, then we'll figure out how much. How do we handle it? Debits and credits. You got it. Good job. But what portion? Whose part? The seller's portion. Genius. Solid. Okay. So now let's figure out the seller's portion. How many days is the seller responsible for from January 1 through August? Or another way to say August is 8, right? 8/23. If August is the 8th month, that means 7 months at 30 days per is 210 days, plus the 23 days in August is 233 days to seller, which is what we need. 233 days to seller times the dollars per day of $17.55 gives an amount the seller's responsible for of $4,089.15. Anybody get something different? Does that make sense? $4,089.15. And that is a buyer credit taking it from the seller and giving it to the buyer. I think that's everything we have to work with out of this list. So now we just go down through here and add things up. Our credit column is smaller in terms of a line item, so $567 for a loan amount plus $3,000 for earnest money, $4,000 for due diligence plus $40,89.15. So a total credits of $578. Let's just round to dollars, call it an $89. And then debits are more. We got 830. Got 83.17. Nope, 71. A little dyslexia for you there. 830 plus 83.71 plus 630 for the sale price plus 85.05 for the origination fee plus $17,010 for the discount points plus $756 for the interim interest. Oops. Oh boy. Somehow I screwed that up. Let me try that again. Real world. Gives us 657, 184. We'll call it 185-ish. And we're just going to subtract the credits from that. So what that buyer needs to bring to closing is $79,096. They might ask you for change. They probably will. Or maybe not, just for simplicity's sake. That makes sense? That's what one of the possible monster questions could look like. The other one, again, would be, what is the seller going to get? That wouldn't take as much. That wouldn't take as many calculations because there's only so many calculations we could do on the seller side. Let's think about it. if they asked what the seller would be getting, that would just mean out of that whole big long problem, deed preparation, we'd need to know that. Taxes, property taxes, what we need to do with that. HOA might be in there. If it's an investment property, rent. We'll show you how to do that here in a second. Taxes, deed prep, excise tax. Of course, sale price. That's about it. Another thing that could come up on the buyer side is this. Here's something they could ask you. If they didn't, we didn't do it in that monster question, but here's what they could say. The lender requires that the attorney collect three months of taxes and 5 months of insurance to set up the buyer's escrow account. So from that last problem, I believe we said that the whole first year's premium is $830. And then I don't remember what we said for taxes, but let's just say the annual tax bill, I'm just going to pull from air here, is $5,353. What would be, how much total to collect to set up the escrow account? Which, by the way, is going to be a buyer debit, right? Got to collect from the buyer 3 months worth of taxes, 5 months worth of insurance. How much is that going to be, those two things added up? These could show up in the monster question too. I just didn't put them in there. What about for insurance? How many dollars worth of insurance in order to pad and calculate and create the escrow account? What's 3 months worth of what's 5 months worth of insurance look like in dollars? I assume you got that by taking $830 for the whole year and dividing it by 12 months, because months is what matters for this, right? Not days. So per day is $69.17 a day times 5 months. So the amount to create the escrow for insurance, 5 months worth, is $345.83. Good. And then the other one, taxes for the year, is $53.53. We just need 3 months worth. Same thing. How much are taxes per month? $446.08. I'm just going to leave it in the calculator. 3 months worth is $1338.25. So if we add these two numbers together, the total needs to be collected to create the escrow account for taxes and insurance combined, $1684.08. So don't forget, when they talk about creating the escrow, you need to divide by 12 because we're dealing in terms of months, numbers of months, not numbers of days. Another commonly made mistake. Rent. Let's talk about rent. This is an investment property now, and the seller has had it as a rental forever. Now they're selling it. And the rent that they collect is $2,300 per month. And the closing is on November 25th. With rent, here's 1 month. We're dealing with just a month, not a whole year. So this timeline is just for the month of November. And we're closing toward the end of the month on the 25th. So here's the one time where the seller's happy about the I forgot my word, where the seller's happy that they get to handle the day of closing, because they also get to keep the rent for the day of closing too. Seller handles day of closing both for paying it out and for getting the money in. What do we know about rent? The renter pays on day one. So what has happened is the seller has gotten the entire $2,300 in rent on day one, but they are having a closing on the 25th. Therefore, we need to have that seller give up some money. We're going to debit the seller and credit the buyer's portion, which is, what is the buyer's portion? Again, since the seller gets the credit for the day of closing, another time to be safe and calculate the seller's days and then subtract it from the total. If you start messing around with the buyer's days, I promise eventually you'll forget that day of closing. So if we count the seller's days, it's $2,300 for the month. What's rent per day? Divided by 30. Rent per day is $76.67 times 25 days. The seller is entitled to keep $1916.67, but they've got all of it. So we need for them to give up some. And so what are they giving up? They're giving up the difference between the total rent and the amount they're entitled to. $2,300 minus $1916.67. The buyer's portion of rent, $383. 33. Boy, that's terrible. 383.33 is going to be debited to the seller, credited to the buyer. We're taking it from the seller because they have the whole rent. They need to give up that last part of the month's rent. That's how we handle rent. I think yeah, that's about it. That's enough to get us started, to get you going on the math there. Now, on I've got two YouTube channels. One of them I'm gonna you know about it. It's called Ask Neil Pinder, but the other one is, let me see. I think I still have a domain pointed to it. Yes, still works. There it is in the chat. Impact Broker Coach. I'm going to be developing that one. And let me show you what that looks like. Here it is. So if you click on the videos tab on that channel, you'll first of all see a bunch of videos from another class I've taught previously, where I basically live streamed it just like I live streamed this. But if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll start seeing these colored thumbnails. That's all the math. I've pretty much done a like for this rent one, it's just a simple voiceover of me just talking through as I do the same thing we just did.
Day of close hashtag. It's also,
so you've got that. I would suggest you watch those and let this, you can pause them. You can speed them up. Don't forget, if you don't know about YouTube, you can click on the wheel and go to playback speed and slow down or speed up. Sometimes when it's something educational and I just want to absorb the content, but I don't want to take forever, I'll 2 times it. And it sounds the same. Doesn't sound like chipmunks, but it definitely helps speed the process up. right, one moment. We're going to move on to 17, chapter 17. There we go. Here we go. 17 is about valuation. It's our last big chapter from like double digit numbers of questions on the test. After this, we get into the smaller ones. I think the renter, landlord, tenant stuff is a couple of hours of class time we're required to do. The rest of them are like little ones and halves and 45 minutes here and there. So several, half a dozen, 6 or 8 of them. And that'll take us through the end of the month. And then pretty much January is a bunch of review. And we've done most of the review already for license law and commission rule. So we'll basically be doing a big review for that. So we're coming right along. Now, real property valuation. What we're going to talk about here is the difference between what we do as brokers and what appraisers do. Because the Real Estate Commission is very specific and strict to make sure that we don't say the wrong words. Who do you think is better at property valuation? Someone who does it a lot or someone who does it sometimes but does a whole bunch of other stuff? We as brokers, we don't only value properties. We don't only figure out what things might sell for. We also show property, help people sell it, market, find leads. But appraisers just do this day in and day out. If they're not out there visiting a property and measuring it and looking around and taking photos of it, they're back at the office doing the research to see what similar properties have sold for, like the one they're trying to figure the value of. The one they're trying to figure the value of, by the way, that you need to know is called the subject property. Subject property, the subject of the appraisal report the appraiser is doing, or the subject of the house that you're trying to list and you're going to do a market analysis for. So we're going to learn all of those terms in this class. What are we allowed to call the thing that we do as brokers versus appraisers? What are some definitions of value and the process of appraising something versus what we do as brokers? And the different types of valuation. There's 3 different approaches to coming up with what something's worth. There's something called the comparable sales approach, where it's sort of like what you would just naturally do if you wanted to figure out something, whether, I do this with guitars and musical equipment. I sold a bunch of musical equipment this month. And so I just went on reverb.com, basically an eBay for music stuff. And I just looked up what similar things have sold for used, and I compare them to new and then the condition. That's the same thing we do with the houses. We look up what similar houses, same kinds of amenities and size, have sold for. So we're going to talk about that process. The sales comparison method is another way to say it. Sales comparison method. But what if it's not like a house in a neighborhood? Because, there's commercial real estate. And what if you're a commercial broker and a piece of property goes for sale, or they want to sell it, and it used to be a school or a government building or a church? There's no neighborhoods of churches. Well, we're in the Bible Belt, so it sort of feels that way sometimes. Every street corner has something. But there's no neighborhood where a church just like the one you're about to list sold last week. You got to do a different thing than a sales comparison method when you have no other sales to compare to. Can't use the sales comparison method if there's no other recent sales to compare it to, so you use what's called the cost approach. And I bet if you had to figure it out just on your own, you would probably come up with pretty much what this is. If you have nothing else to go on, you'd probably say, well, how much does it cost to build a new church building? The building, right? This much. But the one we're figuring the value of is not new, so we need to depreciate how much a new one would cost, and that's it. That's basically the cost approach. Figure out the cost of it new, and then figure out how much you should depreciate it for, depending on the condition, the age and condition. That's the cost approach, and we're going to dig into that a little bit more. The third one is for investment property. I don't have it on this list, but it's called the income capitalization method, income capitalization, or just income method or income approach. What matters more when it's an income producing property is not so much how it looks, but what it performs at, how it performs. How much rent can you get? You might, depending on the location, what if this property is 2 blocks walking distance from NC State University or UNC Chapel Hill, and it's just an old rundown house? That house might be worth more than one that looks really pretty in a subdivision 5 miles away, because in the subdivision it's a bunch of owner occupants, but the one near the university campus is rentable, an investment property that rents out, and those kids would love to have a walking distance house that's not a dorm, and they'd pay for the privilege, no matter how not as pretty, how ugly, how old, how many updates it might need. So it's a whole different type of valuation required when it's an investment property. You don't use the sales comparison approach if it's an investment property. We're not going to compare to what similar houses sold for in the last month like we would if it's like a suburbs house, something being used for owner occupants perhaps. If it's an investment property being sold by an investor and to an investor, then what matters is the financial statement, the bottom line. How much can you make in rent? And other things like, has it been rented at the same amount for a while? Therefore, is it time to raise the rents? That might be a pretty important question that a potential buyer would be looking at. Could I be buying an opportunity to increase what they're already getting because they just maybe got tired of messing with it and they just honored the same? But to me, that current renter, which we do need to honor, we got to let that current renter stay in it. But once their lease is up, it might be time to raise those rents, and that might be another consideration for a new buyer. The appraisal itself there's a process to appraise something, and that process is called reconciliation. We're going to get into that and talk about what the appraisal process looks like. So, who can do what things? The appraiser can do some stuff compared to brokers. Notice we have both kinds of brokers spelled out, because you will be a provisional broker before you will be a non-provisional broker. It might only take you a month or two to go from provisional to non, depending on how quickly you do your post classes. But you're going to have to be both along the journey. And as a provisional broker, there are some things you're not allowed to do. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. Appraisers do appraisals. The thing that an appraiser does is called an appraisal. I know I just blew your mind. But the thing brokers do is not allowed to be called an appraisal. We cannot say on a phone call, hey, Mrs. Seller, I look forward to seeing you Thursday night at 6 p.m. Thank you so much for this opportunity to come and tell you what I'll do to get the most money for your house. It would be wrong for me to say, so what I'm going to do for you is share with you the appraisal I've prepared to help you see what the value of your house is. There's 2 strikes right there. I've done 2 things wrong. The real estate commission would be mad at me for 2 reasons there. I called it an appraisal instead of what I should call it, which is a CMA, comparative market analysis. And then I've also called the number that I'm going to tell her, I called it a value. I'm not allowed to call it a value if I'm a broker. What I call that number that I think it's going to sell for is a probable sales price. That's how we brokers have to call these things. Can't use the word value, can't use the word appraisal. That's what appraisers do. They come up with the value using an appraisal. What is this word value? We're going to be looking at the forces and factors that affect the value, as well as some basic economic principles of value. We've already talked about the three approaches. It's messed up a little bit, but that's the sales comparison method, the cost approach, and the income approach. I'll make that pretty again later. Here's some more terms. Market value. Any idea what I mean by market value? Here's where you plug in. Stop listening and start talking. Either speak up or put it in the chat. What do you think market value means? Market value. That's pretty darn good. Compared to what they definitely got, the market value is what we think it's going to get. We've estimated what we think the buyer will pay and the seller will accept. Good job. Might have been a clue that the word value was in it, and I just made such a big deal over appraiser and value, and appraisers are figuring out what it might be worth. So that however you need to remember it, but you nailed it. Yeah. What about this word? Market price versus market value. What is market price? If value is what we think it's worth, what do we think market price is? You're killing it. Yeah, it's really what it is. One thing that I will tell post licensing students as a suggestion, because I think one of the major points of stress and reservation for a brand new agent is the question they get from a consumer. What's my house worth? What could I get for my house? It's intimidating. It's intimidating for everybody because we're about to tell somebody what they could get for this major financial transaction in their lives. And so one thing I'll suggest to a post-licensing student, once they have access to the MLS, I'll say maybe, pick a neighborhood. Maybe it's your own neighborhood you live in. You want to eventually be the go-to agent for that neighborhood. You sort of adopt it, make it your what we call farm area, where you give some attention to it. You maybe mail things out, maybe knock on the doors, just go plug into the HOA and the events or something. Whatever that area is that you want to dominate someday, pick one that is under contract in the MLS. Because when it's under contract in the MLS, we don't yet see what it actually sold for. They're not allowed to disclose that yet, because if it were to fall apart because of repairs, for instance, now you've told the whole world what the seller had been willing to take. So you can't tell them. So pick an under contract one and do your own market analysis. Try to figure out what you think it's going to be worth. The reason I suggest that they do that to one that's under contract is they don't have to wait as long to find out what it really got. And then put a little alert, which you'll learn about how to do later. Put an alert in the MLS so when it does shift from under contract to close status, you can see, oh, they sold for this. Now pull out your market analysis, look at what they really got, and see how good you are, right? Just kind of a little real world exercise that they can do. So yeah, market value is what you're guessing it's probably going to get. Market price is what it actually got. And then cost. This word cost is sometimes interesting. What do you think we mean by the word cost? Particularly in terms of talking to a seller. The word cost in relation to the seller in the house that they're trying to sell, or that they might want to hire you to sell. That's pretty good. Not just what it's costing to get it sold, but what they've spent on it. Expenditures on the property. The reason I say that it's interesting is historically, it just seems like this is always the case. Sellers tend to give more value in their own mind of what the thing they spent on contributed to the value. That sounded like nonsense. Sellers assume it's going to, if they spend money building a deck or putting on a sunroom, they assume that's going to increase the value more than it usually does. They overestimate that how much more it's going to increase the value. So one frequent conversation you have to have on a listing appointment with the seller is, hey, Mr. Seller, appreciate the tour. You just showed me your entire house. Looks great. You've done so much work. I can see that you take a lot of pride in it, and you should. But that deck out back, that's gorgeous. You said that you and your son went up in the woods in the back and cut down the trees and milled them down into lumber, and you used that lumber to build the deck, and then you carved your wife's face in all of the posts on all the corners, and you wrote your grandkids' names on every step. I can see that is a really special emotional attachment for you. Yeah, you bet it is. So the house down the street I know sold 3 months ago for $300,000. They didn't have a deck like this. So I figure my deck means that mine, if they got 300, I should get 350 for this amazing deck. And now is when you have to have a very important conversation with them without offending them that, look, yeah, okay, I know the deck is important or whatever it is that you've built and done yourself with your own two hands, but did the amount of effort you put in translate to actual extra value? I don't know that, and it's not me. If it were up to me, I would love for you to get 350 for this because it's such fine craftsmanship. However, what we really need to pay attention to is what buyers have been willing to pay for houses with decks. And from my research here, houses that had no deck versus ones that did got 310 versus 300. You might have to give them some bad news because past expenditures on the property may or may not add any value. Maybe they spent money on the wrong stuff. And you have to sometimes explain to them, this was pretty much for your own benefit, like for your own enjoyment. It doesn't really translate to market value. Things that translate to market value tend to be like kitchen and bathroom renovations, but not so much like gold hardware instead of silver hardware. Right now we're getting into personal preferences, and that might end up working against people sometimes. So the appraisal, sorry for the blanks, what those are supposed to say is the appraisal is done by an appraiser, and the CMA is a comparative or competitive market analysis. That's done by a broker. And then a broker's price opinion, surprise, surprise, is also done by a broker. Both of those things are those are the two things that we as brokers can do. But they're pretty much the same math, the same effort. We still, whether it's a CMA or BPO, we still do the same process as brokers. We still look at similar houses. We compare extra things, garage, 2-car garage versus 3-car, brick versus vinyl, and attach a dollar amount adjustment for them and either add or subtract those adjustments to the comparable properties to figure out what the subject should sell for. We're going to get into that when we come back from break. So I'll see you in 10 minutes.
get to love you.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Here we are. Okay. So we've talked about appraisal versus CMA versus BPO. The appraisal is done by an appraiser. The CMA and BPO are both done by brokers. Now, what is it? What is the difference? First of all, we as brokers can never call a CMA or BPO an appraisal. But what's the difference? Here we go. A CMA is something that we as brokers do as part of the process of listing a house. It's free, right? It's included in the many tasks associated with listing someone's house. We may do the CMA and not get the listing, so we might do the work for nothing, but it's part of that listing process. Hopefully you get the listing before you do much of the CMA, maybe. The BPO, though, is done for money. If you'll notice, it's a little small there. I need to make that a little bigger. The CMA is done for clients or potential clients. There's a fiduciary responsibility included there. The BPO is done for third-party people, customers. There's not a fiduciary responsibility with the BPO. It's something that if somebody wants to know what their house might sell for and they don't want to pay an appraiser, they could pay a broker to do a BPO, broker price opinion. Third-party people who might want to pay for a BPO would include a for sale by owner. Maybe it's a seller who knows that you're an agent, but they still don't want to hire you to list it, but they trust and value your opinion, and they say to you, hey, I'm not going to list with you. I want to sell it myself, but I do value that you know the area, that know the neighborhood. Can I pay you $75, $100 for you to tell me what you think it should sell for? And that is okay. You can do that. So it might be a for sale by owner that wants to pay you to tell them what their house might sell for. It might also be a bank. A bank might say, look, we know that you do a lot of sales in the area. We're thinking about foreclosing on a property. Would you do a BPO for us? Give us your broker's price opinion. We'll pay you $100 if you'll tell us your opinion on what it's worth as part of our decision on whether or not to foreclose on the property. They're behind 3 or 4 months. We have a choice to make. Do we want to initiate foreclosure proceedings or not? We don't. Why would they not want to do an appraisal? Why would they not want to get an appraisal, but instead just get a BPO from you? What do you think is the reason? Because we just said appraisers are better at it. Definitely cheaper, like a fourth of the cost. An appraisal might be $400, $500, $600 or more. A BPO, you'll be lucky if you get $75 or $100 for doing a broker price opinion. So, is it worth it? Would you tell me in the chat or just nod? Would you do a BPO for $100? Or do you need to know more information? Because maybe what you want to know is, how many hours will it take for me to do a BPO? Because if it's going to take 40 hours, then that $100 doesn't look so attractive. If it's going to take 1 hour, then that $100 looks pretty good to me too. I would do it. But the truth is, the BPO, somebody that hires you to do a broker price opinion, especially if it's a bank or maybe an investment group or somebody, they may very well, especially a bank, going to require you to use their own software, log into a website where they want you to plug in all the pertinent data. Now, that means you would need to put in the data for the subject property, the one they need to know the value of or the price, and then also put in the pertinent data to compare it to for at least 3 other properties that have sold. Now we're getting into some time. You're basically plugging things into an online spreadsheet and then also doing your own math adjustments, because no 2 houses are identical, right? In this situation, you've got a subject property that has a 2-car garage. There's one that sold down the street, very similar, that had a 3-car garage. How much is 1-car garage worth in difference? In other words, the one that sold last week, they got $350. They had one more garage than the one you need to figure out what it might sell for. So how much do we need to subtract from that $350 to account for that garage? $10,000, $12,000, $20,000? It depends. It depends on the neighborhood, the price range, how finished the garage is. It also depends on whether or not most houses like this in this area have garages or not. If they all have garages and this is the one that doesn't, then it may not be worth as much to make that garage adjustment. Or if nothing has a garage and this one does, it might be worth more because people would love to be in this area and have the rare house that has a garage. And it's not just garages. Other adjustments that need to be made for the sales comparison method include the type of siding: brick, stone, stucco, hard coat, real stucco. They are all pretty much low to no maintenance siding compared to vinyl, wood, masonite, even hardy plank, the cement composite that's pretty nice. It's made of cement, so it won't rot, but it does fade. It does have to be painted every so often, so that has some maintenance requirement. All of that stuff factors in. So type of siding, garages, square footage, of course, because no two houses are going to be exactly the same size. And then remember the yellow book? Where is the square footage difference between the subject property and the one that sold last week that we're comparing it to? Is it the same on the upper level where it's above the grade of the ground, or is it only different in the basement? The comparable property had another 300 feet of finished space in the basement versus the subject has no basement. All of that factors into how much those differences are worth. And that's what you have to learn over time, and by hopefully talking to appraisers and other brokers in your BIC and doing the work, learning what things are worth. One time an appraiser told me, kind of jokingly or laughing about it, he said, yeah, I'll never forget the time that broker, he didn't name the broker, he said a broker, a real estate agent, asked me where my list was. And this agent had asked him where his list was. What list? The list where you make all your adjustments from, what a fireplace is worth, what a garage is worth. And he had to laugh because there is no list. It depends. Are we talking about Lake Norman, the peninsula on Lake Norman, or are we talking about some little tiny production home that's neighborhood that's all vinyl sided, 15 years old? The cost of a garage or the value of a garage is going to be different in those two places, right? Location matters. So BPO versus CMA. Brokers can do either one. One of them, the BPO, is for a non-client. It's not part of the listing duties. It's just a one-off. It's just a, hey, tell me what this should sell for. I'll pay you a little bit of money to tell me how much you think this might sell for. Now, as a new broker, you're going to get out of this class. You're going to take the PSI. You're going to pass it. You're going to be a provisional inactive broker. Then you're going to go pick a firm, pick a BIC, and affiliate with that firm, and therefore now you're ready to make money. You probably need to subscribe to the MLS, get your lockbox key, figure out the sign and the business card and all that fun stuff, but now you're ready. I have some bad news because only non-provisional brokers are allowed to do BPOs. Might be another incentive for you to go ahead and take those post classes. You cannot do BPOs for money if you're a provisional broker. You have to at least be a non-provisional broker. So that's a testable item. Be aware of that. Make sure you get that one right. So appraisers give a market value in the form of an exact number. We brokers give a probable sales price. The thing we call this number is a probable sales price, what we think it will probably sell for. And it's really smart to not give that in the form of an exact number. If you're giving them a probable sales price, you should do that in a range. because you don't know. Some things are out of your control. The seller might promise to clean up the property and straighten it up and get all the stuff out. Maybe it's borderline hoarding going on. And that seller says, yeah. Okay, in 3 weeks, we're going to list the property. I'm going to list it with you. I promise to do all this cleaning. What's the most I could get for it if it's in perfect condition? And if you tell them a probable sales price, I think you'll get $425. Then in 3 weeks, when they inevitably don't do any of the work they promised to do, they're still going to expect to get $425. Do you understand that's how human nature works? They're going to forget their end of the bargain, and they're going to expect you to deliver what you promised. But what you promised was requiring them to do work. They're not going to remember that part. So it's in your best interest, it's in their best interest too, to never say a number. Give them a range. What you would say is, and then back it up with an email so that you can point to it later in writing. Say, look, if you do the work, you could see, I could expect it to sell for the upper end of a range between 415 and 425, 410 and 425. But if you don't do the work, it's probably going to be on the lower end of that range. Give yourself some cushion, right? Because it really does depend on what product they give you to work with. People get busy. People get lazy. Sellers haven't had to do much to get top dollar in these last couple of years, and they still think that's the case. Not every seller has realized and come to understand that we're not in that market anymore. We are shifting as we speak. Sellers have to bring more to the table. They've got to bring a good product that looks still. It's always the case that the best presented house, cleanest, most tidy, most picked up with least amount of garbage thrown everywhere, even just personal property and knickknacks and crazy painted walls or painted walls that need to be painted because they're so dirty and gross. You don't get away with that. You pay for that in the form of lower prices. And so sellers that are smart today are cluing into that and putting themselves in a more dominant position by paying attention to old school methods. It's just classic advice. Make it a good product. You wash the car to sell the car. Prepare the house to sell the house. Get it nice and neutral. Why no colors? Why no crazy colors? Some houses, you stand in one spot in the hallway and you can see 5 different colors in 5 different rooms. That makes it hard for a buyer to see themselves in the house. That's why traditionally we've called it realtor beige, because back in the day it was all about the color beige. Now that has been replaced by gray and some hybrid in between. Now they sometimes will call it grayish, like something between beige and gray, something neutral. And then take all that stuff that you live with and love, put it in boxes because you got to box it up anyway. And I'd rather it be filled up in the garage than cluttering up the house because, again, we're trying to make this house into something they could see themselves living in. That's the big speech you got to give them. So appraisers give a market value in a number. Brokers give a sales price in the probable sales price in a range. Now, when we're doing the market analysis, the CMA or comparative market analysis method, again, the house we're trying to list, or if it's a BPO that we're trying to figure out what it's going to sell for, that's called the subject property, the one in question. And traditionally, for the most part, whether it's an appraisal or a CMA or a BPO, we want to compare it to at least 3 properties that have sold, 3 that have sold in the last recent past, not old, not a year ago, hopefully no more than a month ago. Sometimes you can't find them that are no more than a month ago that they sold. You have to go back a little further. But the further you go back, the more of an adjustment that you would need to account for, because what things sold for last even 6 months ago is not what they sell for today. What they sold for last year, certainly not what they're going to sell for today. So 3 comparable properties, at least. Sometimes because it was so close or maybe difficult to come up with it in your analysis, sometimes the lender asks the appraiser to put another sold comp, a fourth one in, because they're not confident in the appraisal report. So those comps are what people call it. That's what we're comparing that subject property to. So the appraiser's doing an appraisal. Here's what it looks like at the top of the page when that appraiser has finished their report. Look at that part circled. This report is an opinion. Now, it looks super complicated. It looks really fancy. But at the end of the report, end of the day, it's just an opinion of that one appraiser's opinion of value. That's all it is. In fact, it's always been funny to me that this is how it works, but the appraiser is given the assignment along with the sales price number. When they go in to do the appraisal, they know what the contract price is, which is kind of interesting. They're still held to a standard. They cannot go crazy. They're not supposed to they've got to justify what they say it's worth. They have an appraisal standards board, just like we have a real estate commission that keeps us in check. So there are minimum standards of practice that they must operate within. And then they've got to have a license. The process to become an appraiser, I believe it's about 5 or 6 classes, like college type classes. And then the kicker is an entire year that they have to act as an apprentice and be sponsored by another appraiser who shows them the ropes. They basically do appraisal work under another appraiser and make a tiny bit of money in the process for a whole year. But once they get that year over with and they get rid of their apprentice status or get out of their apprenticeship, I've heard of appraisers who immediately go out on their own, and now they're whatever they made on an appraisal, they can multiply it times 4 or 5 or 6. And so an appraisal costs $500 or $600. As an apprentice appraiser, they might have made $50 or $100 because part of that is giving it up to the one that's mentoring you. That's what they get in the process. It's hard to find a willing appraiser who's willing to mentor. I've asked every appraiser I've ever met out at a house, out at a listing, and most of them either don't want to do it or are doing their last one. They don't want to do it anymore. Because in a way, if you think about it, they're really kind of training their eventual potential competition. So anyway, it's just an opinion of value. 2 different appraisers, if they did not see the subject or the sales price that was going to be on the contract, if they didn't see it, they'd come up with pretty, and they still do, even though they do see the sales price, they quite often come up with different numbers. When it comes to a transaction in real estate, the big moment of relief is when that listing agent, the buyer agent calls and says, "Good news, the property appraised." The listing agent will almost all the time then say, "Oh, cool, that's great. What did it appraise for?" But the appraisal is the property of the buyer. That's who paid for it. Therefore, it would be up to the buyer whether to disclose what it appraised for. The seller always wants to know what it appraises for, but you don't want to tell them. If you're on the buyer's side, it doesn't serve anybody's purpose to tell them, especially if it appraises for more than the sale price, because that seller's just going to be mad that they're going to feel like they could have gotten more. But what it appraises for doesn't have much to do with what it's really worth at that point. Just be happy that it appraised. So a smart buyer agent will say, well, the buyer doesn't want me to disclose what it appraised for, but we're okay. It appraised for enough. We can move forward with the transaction. Looking forward to seeing you at closing. And usually that's good enough for everybody. So that appraisal is just an in-depth comparison of the subject property to those 3 comparable properties, making adjustments for the differences in things that we just talked about: age, condition, garage, siding, kitchen upgrades, bathroom upgrades, square footage, acreage, even location. Maybe it's a neighborhood that's really nice with lots of amenities compared to another neighborhood. They had to go outside of the neighborhood because there weren't. Ideally, an appraiser wants to only compare to houses inside the same neighborhood. But sometimes, if not enough of them have sold recently enough, they have to venture away and hopefully pick a neighborhood that's still pretty similar. But if maybe this is the only neighborhood with a fancy HOA, swim and tennis facilities, and everything else outside in other neighborhoods have no HOA, no swimming pool, no tennis court, they would adjust for that sort of thing too. Here's another testable question. How long is the appraisal good for? Tell me in the chat. Speak out or type up. What is the duration? How long is that appraisal good for? That's a good guess. Ben says 30 days. Everybody join in. Tell me something. Put something in. It's a weird answer. 3 months? Give me a couple more guesses. Two more guesses. Once closing is done, I like that one. Makes sense. One more guess. Ooh, that's pretty good too. When due diligence is due. I like it. So it is the case that the one appraisal that gets done serves that transaction. So it does make sense to think about maybe 30 days, maybe through the closing. But think about this. That appraisal, in a moment, we'll look at what an appraiser wants to pick when it comes to comparables, how to pick good comps. They need to be comparables that are similar size, similar amenities, but more than that, they need to be things that have sold pretty recently. So what if an appraiser gets called out to do the work, and they go do the appraisal today, and they go out and visit the property, they come back and do the research, they crank out that report, and they print it out today, and they deliver it. That report is based on the most recent comps up until today. But what if tomorrow an even better house that's an even closer match in every way closes? Because you can't use it as a comp until it's closed. It might have been under contract this whole time. The appraisal report's printed today, delivered today. Now that's the appraisal. Those comps are what they had to work with. Tomorrow, let's make it worse. 2 houses close tomorrow that are even better matches than the ones used in the appraisal report. Already, it's kind of out of date. It's not as accurate as it would have been if it would have happened tomorrow. But it happened today. It was created at the limitation, with the limitations of whatever comps were available to be used to this point. In that respect, that third bullet point there, yes, there is an expiration date of an appraisal pretty much as soon as it's printed out, as soon as the paper cools off from the printer, because at that point, a better comp could pop up at any minute. Now, yes, the appraisal that's in existence still serves for that transaction, so it's not like it's void or no good anymore. But just with that in mind, the appraisal is only as current as the day it's printed. It could be a better appraisal, could have been a better appraisal if a better comp had popped up before it was finally done, if that makes any sense. So even if remember we said that a provisional broker cannot do a broker price opinion. You've got to be non-provisional or full broker to do a BPO. But even if you are a full broker, non-provisional, you still can't do a BPO in some situations. So say no to the BPO if it's for one of these below, if it's originating the mortgage. A lender could ask you, hey, I want to make a loan, do a mortgage, originate a mortgage. I don't want to pay those appraisers. They make too much. I don't want to pay $600. I'll pay you $120. You're not allowed to do it. They cannot use a BPO for creating or originating a mortgage. Not allowed. They have to foot the bill, get that borrower to pay for full price appraisal. So appraisals have to be done when it's originating a mortgage. Appraisals have to be used when it's refinancing a mortgage. And then sometimes the law just requires that it be an appraisal, nothing less. So those are the cases where a BPO are not allowed. If it's originating or refinancing a mortgage, or if the law requires an appraisal over everything else. There are some elements of value. We can remember them with the acronym DUST. DUST, elements of value. Desirability, that affects value. How desirable is it? Lakefront property, pretty desirable. That's why it costs more, right? Financial ability also affects desirability. Utility, how's the buyer going to use it? If this buyer wants to buy this property because it's one of the few that allows them to operate a home-based business, then that's going to affect the value of the property, because the buyers who need to use home-based businesses are going to want it, and there's not many others for them to pick from. Utility, how that buyer needs to make use, or on the commercial sector, what's it zoned for, right? Location, in terms of being close to the industrial side of town because they make things. Maybe it's one of these hybrid types of properties where it's an office space in the front of the building and then warehouse space in the back. My wife works for a place where they have office space in the front and they actually make mechanical devices in the back. They'll sell the parts to make those things, but then they also will custom make them as needed depending on the client. But it's one big building. So not everybody needs a building like that. Scarcity, goes back to that old saying about real estate: location, location, location. Limited supply affects value. How scarce is it? In general, what we've just come out of, or slowly now getting out of, is a seller's market. So the whole market had scarcity. There were not as many houses as we needed to satisfy the buyer's demand. So that was the entire market, was a market of scarcity. Transferability applies to how easy is it to buy it, to transfer it from one to the next. Is it in decent condition? Maybe we're in a market where buyers can be more picky and they don't pay as much if it's not in as good a shape. When we flip to another kind of market, that's what's going to be the case. Buyers won't pay as much if it needs paint, carpet, work. Is it a clouded title? Remember, we learned in the first couple weeks that you could still sell a property that has a cloudy title. It's just that you're probably not going to get as much for it because the buyer has to deal with the cloud stuff. They've got to deal with clearing up that title. So that transferability, how hard, how easy is it to transfer because of a title issue, because of condition, because of financing? Maybe lenders won't finance it. Remember, one of the advantages of a VA loan is that the VA itself would loan money and make a loan in the rare case that a lender would not, because it's so rural, right? Lender, maybe it's hard to find a lender willing to loan because the property is so far out into the sticks. But the VA, says, we're going to take care of our veteran, therefore we will make this loan. They don't want to originate loans, but they would in that event. So how hard is it to transfer the property? Properties have some element of all these qualities to have value. Some forces affecting property values: social, economic, political, and physical. 4 forces that affect property values. Social values. Could be things like neighborhoods that have fancy amenities. There's a neighborhood in Charlotte called Davis Lake that's really big. It's been around since I've been in the business. They have been known for having a lot of social groups as part of their HOA. If that's your thing, you want to join groups, then maybe, and by the way, their HOA dues are more expensive than the surrounding neighborhoods, but you're paying for the advantage of having lots of groups to plug into if that's what you like. Around the corner is another neighborhood called Highland Creek. They don't have as many social groups. They have a lot of nice amenities, though, swim and tennis, like 4 or 5 separate pool areas. If that's more your thing, then that's for you, right? So, social ways to affect value, economic forces affecting value, taxes. In Charlotte, we're unique in that Charlotte draws people in for the jobs, but maybe they don't want to actually live in Charlotte because our school busing situation has not been dependable. You might have a child assigned to a school that's near the house you buy this year, but next year they redraw the lines and now your child gets sent across town. So, to combat that, to kind of help protect against that, historically buyers have said, well, I'll work in Charlotte, and since it's not a far commute, I'll drive 20 or 30 minutes to the surrounding cities and towns, Harrisburg and Concord and Cabarrus to the northeast, Mount Holly and Belmont to the west, even Denver up in the kind of the northwest, even South Carolina, Fort Mill, Rock Hill. So places where, well, those aren't great examples of that, but the Concord side, the Mount Holly side are great examples of the taxes probably being lower than what you're going to get in the city limits of Charlotte. And then school dependability as well. Politics, zoning, obviously who's on the zoning board can affect whether or not they allow zoning to be changed. You see these yellow and blue signs means it's going to go up for a decision, a vote on whether to change the zoning of this parcel of property. And so political forces affecting value is it going to get rezoned or not? Then physical, of course, proximity. How close is it to conveniences? Whether it's light rail, public transportation, interchanges and outer loops, beltways, major thoroughfares, those physical locations. That's physical is one of the 4 forces affecting value, just because of convenience. There are some economic principles of value, not this kind of principle. We're talking about economic ones. Here's the one appraisers care about the most: highest and best use. Highest and best use. The appraiser in their report is thinking about this question the whole time. What is the highest and best use for this property? Or is the current owner putting it to its highest and best use? And so we've got the case here where it's a farmland on the right, neighborhood development on the left. And so that farmer over there on the right, are they using their property to its highest and best use economically? Tell me in the chat. Do you think that farmland is being put to its highest and best use? You know, I guess it depends on the crop. If we're in Denver, if we're in Colorado or California or wherever certain kinds of crops are grown that might be worth a lot, then maybe it is. Now, highest and best use is all about the economics, but maybe that farmer and their heirs, their kids, are going to take it over and they're just fine and happy as they can be. They don't care about highest and best use, but in terms of valuation, probably the case that putting more houses on it compared to farming it is going to be put to a better or higher and better use. Hang on 1 second here. Okay. All right, we're good. Here's another one. Here's another one. I think this is in Toronto, and it's in the downtown area. So there's a lot of skyscrapers, a lot of big office buildings, but then right there amongst them is a little pink house. And that house is on, I don't know, I would estimate maybe as much as an acre, maybe less of space. Is that house being used at its economic highest and best use? I don't know. If it's some kind of historic place, maybe. But if not, if it could better be used as something else, what else might be a good thing that would be the higher and better use for a piece of land, attractive land amongst those buildings. What other things, if they were to tear down this house and put something in its place? Yeah, apartment, sure. Yeah, Ben gets it. He knows I like that word. It depends. Sure thing. You know, one time in a class I said this, and I was all about like more office buildings. Somebody said parking. How about a parking deck? That's pretty brilliant. Yeah, if you have all those office buildings, you probably could benefit from parking. That might very well be the highest and best use. Another principle, economic principle of value, is substitution. So the idea here is we have two pretty much identical houses. The one asking less is probably the one that's going to get sold first, right? Everything else the same except the price. They're more serious about selling. 215 versus 220. That's probably going to sell first. When several items with similar amenities and utilities are available, the one with the lower price will get the most demand. And that's the cornerstone of that whole sales comparison method to valuation that we're going to be talking more about. Supply and demand, we're seeing that now in one direction. Here is, this is kind of what has been going on. We've got limited supply and more demand. But that could flip. That could always flip. Here's the opposite. We got lots of houses for sale and not enough buyers for them. Now we've got a buyer's market. Now the buyer gets picky. Now the buyer says, look, you need me more than I need you. I've got like 10 houses just like yours to pick from. You should be honored that I'm even making an offer on your house. Therefore, I will pay you 10% less than what you're asking. I will insist that you fix everything that shows on the inspection report, or I'm walking. I'm giving you $300 of due diligence money, and you should be thankful for it. I'm putting up $100 of earnest money, and I want 4 weeks of due diligence period, all the way up to 3 days before closing. And you're going to provide a home warranty, and I want you to pay $4,000 toward my closing costs. That's going to happen someday when it's a heavily buyer's market. When it's a buyer's market, the same way it's been a seller's market these last couple of years. It's going to happen someday. I can't tell you when, but it's coming. It always comes. There's always a cycle. So this is the opposite. This is that buyer's market concept. There's also the principle of conformity. Now, when it comes to people and talent, whether it's athletes or actors or academics, those who are unique and gifted in their abilities are probably getting paid more, you would hope, right? Either because of hard work or just because they can perform. They can perform better than the average, therefore they get paid better than the average. But when it comes to real estate, it doesn't work that way. That unique property on the left, called a geodesic dome, they say that it's really good for utilities. They say that it's really of a tight kind of a cheaper utility house and probably got all kinds of good advantages. But who here, raise your hand, wants to buy that house? If it costs the same as one of the ones on the right, who's going for the round house? Anybody? Nobody's willing to pay $300,000 for the left-hand house. It's neighborhoods that have a bunch of houses that look alike. Those are the houses that appreciate the best, most dependably. Why? Because you can prove it. You can prove what they're worth. There's no neighborhoods, at least around here in North Carolina, that are a bunch of round ball spherical houses like that. Therefore, it's hard to value them. But it's a lot easier to value the ones on the right because you have whole neighborhoods full of them. We have proof what buyers are willing to pay. Another part of that conformity is this. Let's just say that the house on the right is always this way. Let's say that the driveway always looks like this. This isn't just a party. So if the house on the left they want to sell, they might be a little frustrated because potential buyers might not want to live next to a car lot. And they would pay more for the one on the left if their neighbor, the one on the right, didn't have cars all the time. and have street parking. Some neighborhoods you drive through, the driveways are so small, everybody parks on the street. Those neighborhoods probably sell for less than neighborhoods with bigger driveways where people don't or aren't allowed to park on the street just because of the aesthetics. And then there's this one, another conformity, principle of conformity. You know, maybe not so bad if you're in this house because you don't have to really see it until you drive home. But if you're looking out at this house from across the street and you're trying to sell, might scare away a couple of buyers, just like this one. Although I kind of like this one. I'd like a necktie in that pattern maybe. Here's one. These guys have had a problem. They're having neighbor issues. So Bob was fussing about the fence not being painted, and it finally got painted. Again, if Bob's trying to sell his house when this happens, maybe that potential buyer's like, what kind of neighborhood is this? What kind of HOA is running the show here? Is there an HOA? And here's a case of why you might want one, so that they could insist that he finish painting the fence. And then here's my favorite one. We're conforming to our hedge trimming. This is when Bob and whoever his neighbor is finally get to their limits. All of these are principles of conformity. We needed to kind of match up, look like what similar things are, because it's the whole basis upon which this sales comparison method depends. It's how we know what buyers are willing to pay. Another principle, economic principle, is anticipation. Value is affected by what might be coming. And you can kind of see in the background, it's like, you know, that building right there on the left is kind of old, got some rust stains on it. You can see the signs there on the right side in the distance. It's just a part of town that needs to be revitalized, and that's coming. It's going to be eventually. So a smart investor who's able to go ahead and pull the trigger would maybe buy up some of these properties so that when it starts looking like what's in the coming soon sign, it'll be worth more because people have invested in really nice buildings. So that anticipation affects value. So does roads coming through, like 485 Loop in Charlotte, crossing over roads like Rocky River Road and Harrisburg Road. The properties that were on Rocky River and Harrisburg Road before the Loop came in were not worth the same as they were after the Loop went in, because now you've got prime real estate for McDonald's and gas stations and all the things that like to go in where major intersections happen. Principle of contribution says that just because you do something to your property doesn't mean it's going to add value. There are lots of amenities that don't really contribute value, like this guy. The best way to buy a pool is to buy a property that has a pool. Much cheaper than putting in your own pool from scratch, brand new. Because pools, they have just as many people that don't want them as do want them. And you might spend 20, 30 grand on a pool, and that's kind of lower end, but is it going to add 20 or 30 to the price? Two properties worth 300 without a pool. One puts in one. They spend 25,000 to put in a pool. Are they going to be able to sell it for 325? Probably not. Maybe 305. Something more than the other one, but not the amount more that it cost them probably. So that principle of contribution, some things add to, some things take away. The principle of competition says that profits attract competition. The more you've proven that profits are happening, the more people want to come and get their own part of those profits. Too much competition affects value too. I like to say it this way. McDonald's is never lonely. Do you ever see an intersection with only one fast food restaurant? They don't last long. That's why there's Starbucks across the street from Starbucks, Shell across the street from BP, because they've proven to be a profit center and more people come wanting some of that profit. Comes back around to this: how many similar properties are on the market? So when we do our market analysis for a listing, for a seller, we're not only seeing what similar things have sold for, we also want to take a look at what else is there for a buyer to choose from. We want to take a look at the actively competing listings. If there's 23 houses similar to your new listing that are also for sale, we probably want to do something with the pricing strategy. Maybe undercut everybody or come up with something that sets us apart, point out the things that are really special and unique about your new listing. So that principle of competition kicks in that regard too. And finally, the last one, the principle of change affects value. There's Charlotte 100 years ago on the left. There's me on the bicycle. See right there at the bottom? And then there's Charlotte on the right. Nothing stays the same. Things change. Neighborhoods have cycles. And we'll talk more about those cycles when we come back. I'll see you tomorrow. Put your name in the chat for me. Let me know if you have any questions.